Hello, and thank you for joining the Muscadine Educational Conference as part of the 2021 Virtual Southeast Fruit and Vegetable Conference. I'm Patrick Connor, professor with the Horticulture Department at the University of Georgia, and I'll be serving as the moderator for this presentation. Pesticide CEU and CCA credits are available for most presentations offered during the live Southeast Regional Conference. Check the Pesticide CEU guide for a list of approved presentations and participating states. The Pesticide CEU guide is located in the Event Resources tab under the Media Player. The guide is also available at the Resources Center located on the main menu of the conference platform. Please note, Pesticide CEU credits will only be available for registered attendees and only during the live conference. Credits will not be available for on-demand viewing. There is a simple three-step process to receive Pesticide CEU and CCA credits. First, go to the audience chat box located on the left side of your screen and type your first name, last name, and the states for which you're requesting credits. Again, go to the audience chat box located on the left side of your screen and type your first name, your last name, and the states for which you're requesting credits. You will need to do this for every presentation to request CEU credits. The second step is to sign out at the end of the presentation. To sign out, you're going to do the same thing. Go to the audience chat box and type your first name, last name, and the states for which you're requesting credits. You will be reminded to sign out at the end of the presentation. The third step is to complete the Pesticide CEU registration. You only have to complete this registration one time during the conference. This is not required for every presentation. To access the Pesticide CEU registration web link, open the Pesticide CEU guide on the Event Resources tab located under the Media Player. The Pesticide CEU registration web link is located on the front cover of the guide. This presentation is pre-recorded to reduce technical difficulties. We will be answering your questions live at the end of the presentation. You can submit a question at any point during this presentation by typing your question in the questions box and pressing send. Don't forget to thank our 2021 conference sponsors and exhibitors by visiting the virtual trade show and the featured products pavilion. Lastly, don't forget to join us each morning for coffee chats and each evening for networking. Check the conference agenda for details. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. David Lockwood, horticulturist with a split appointment between the University of Tennessee and the University of Georgia, who will be presenting his talk, Pushing the Boundaries of Muscadine Production. David works in the boundary regions of Tennessee and Georgia. This region has many fruit crops and represents probably the more northern region of muscadine adaptation. In this talk, David will recount some of his observations of how to successfully grow muscadines in these regions.
Hi, I'm Dave Lockwood, University of Tennessee fruit and nut crop specialist, and we want to talk a little bit about pushing the northern boundaries for muscadine production. When I started at the University of Tennessee back in the 70s, commercial muscadine production was discouraged in all parts of the state. In fact, in early 70s, I planted a vineyard in Jackson, east of Memphis, about 70 miles. And over the first 5 years that we had it, it was killed back to the ground 3 times. It was quite common to get a lot of winter injury, and so that pretty much discouraged us. But things have changed over the last several years, and muscadine production, commercial muscadine production, has moved to most parts of the state of Tennessee, except for the higher elevations of the Cumberland Plateau or East Tennessee. And muscadines and muscadine wines constitute a very big part of our grape wine industry. So we're quite interested in production of this crop. I don't have any magic formula for growing muscadines in Tennessee. Primarily what we look at is pretty close attention to all aspects of crop production, and we're going to run through those. One of the first things we look at on any fruit crop, and muscadine certainly comes in that, is selection of site. And site selection is probably the most important decision we'll make in the life of the vineyard, because it's going to impact everything that happens in that vineyard. So depending on what our goal is with the vineyard, we're looking at accessibility. You know, do we want to get people out to the farm for the winery or for harvest? And after that, we're starting to look at characteristics of the site from a growing standpoint. Things like full sun, elevation to get that vineyard up above the most of the surrounding areas, so that we've got some natural passive frost protection, some disease protection is critical. And then we'll look at slope, or what direction does the slope face if we indeed are on a slope, and how steep is it. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those characteristics. And then soils are going to be, of course, critical. No grapevine, and muscadine certainly are included in that, will tolerate wet feet throughout the growing season. So one of the things we look at in soils are drainage conditions, both internal and surface, potential rooting depth, and then we'll look at issues like soil pH and soil fertility. Water, most of our vineyards are not irrigated. However, that's not saying that we wouldn't benefit from them, especially in the early years. And so it's important to look at water both from a quantity and quality standpoint. Another thing that we've started looking at recently is wildlife. We do have increasing issues with wildlife, and that has a negative impact on vineyard performance. Deer are a real issue for us. And of course, once we get fruiting, then we start to look at other aspects from wildlife as far as birds and turkeys and so on. And then we do have some interest in organic production. So it's important to be aware of what's going on next door when we look at the site. You know, are there things happening there that could have a negative aspect on performance of those vines? So that's going to be the primary things we look at in selection of the site. Once the site has been selected, we want to make sure that we take plenty of time to prepare it for planting. And so we look at 6 months to a year or longer, depending on the condition of the site, getting it ready. And I think that the time we spend preparing the site is probably the most important period in the life of the vineyard. We want to get the soil pH right, get the nutritional status of the soil correct, and then we'll look at other aspects. And so in pre-plant soil testing, I like this soil test at 2 depths, upper 8 inches and then 8 to 16-inch depth. I want to know what we're looking at in the topsoil, but also the subsoil, because we're going to have enough root systems down into that lower level that we want to make sure we do what we can to prepare a good environment for plant growth and fruiting. Prior to planting is a good time to get rid of noxious weeds, whether it's chemical weed control or mechanical. It's a lot easier to do it, and there are a lot more options from herbicide standpoint before the vines are in the ground than afterwards. mentioned elevation, and one of the things on elevation is air drainage. Well, along with that, within the site, any barriers to good air drainage need to be removed prior to planting, whether it's a grown-up ditch bank or hedgerow or what have you, or dense brush at the lower part of the vineyard. If anything we can do to help that air move better within and out of the vineyard is going to benefit us in production. If there should happen to be a wet spot in the field, can it be drained? Tile drainage will work, and we can pull water out of that site and make it a viable site for planting. Or if we've got enough problems with it, marginal problems, we may be able to do some minor raised bed work to help it, or in the extreme conditions, of course, look for another site. It's good if wild or abandoned vines near the site are taken care of, are eliminated. They can be a reservoir of problems, both insect and disease, and so getting rid of those can make caring for the vineyard a lot easier. Then finally, of course, we're going to look at establishing the vineyard floor because, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on, but it has a lot of impact on vineyard performance. So why are we, well, the ideal soil for pH for muscadines, if you look at the literature, we'll talk about 5.5 up to 6.5. I like to, in advance of planting, get that soil pH up above 6. And if I could get it to 6.5, I would like that, because hopefully our vineyard is going to be in the ground and performing well for the next 25, 30 years. And once that vine is in the ground, our ability to modify subsoil pH is economically and realistically gone. We're not going to be able to do much. So take care of it up front. And why is pH important? Well, for the most part, the more acid the soil gets, the more limitations we have on uptake of many of our nutrients, primarily the macronutrients. And so we can get a lot more benefit out of our fertilizer program if we can have the pH correct, and we do that up front. As far as getting that pH and any nutrients adjusted, primarily phosphorus and to a lesser extent potassium, in advance of planting, what we'll do is soil test the 2 levels, like I said, add the lime requirement or the P requirement for the upper 8-inch to the lower 8-inch, put that down, disc it or rototill it to mix it in the topsoil, and then plow it down so that we can actually put that amended soil further down in the soil profile, and that'll adjust it. Then that can set the baseline for the life of the vineyard. Potassium, depending on soils, may be somewhat mobile in the soil. If it is not too mobile, use the same philosophy in putting potassium down in advance of planting. So another thing that we look at in pre-plant is selection of varieties, and there's not a lot of information out there on it, and not a lot of options. So if we look at the varieties that we're growing, Carlos is probably the most common variety you'll see in muscadine plantings throughout Tennessee. And the others that I have listed up here we'll see as well. But we pretty much have to take what's out there, and there's not a lot that's set up for the conditions that we may see in Tennessee. Muscadines have a relatively short chilling requirement, which could put them in danger of cropping. But one of the nice things about them is that they also tend to have a relatively high heat accumulation requirement. And so even though we may satisfy chilling on muscadine relatively early and over the winter months, it may be on up into the spring after we've seen activity in bunch grapes before we see much activity in muscadine. And this factor alone will make muscadine successful in some areas that we would be, other words, somewhat reluctant to plant in. If we look at the timeline for the vineyard, and this is kind of what I like to lay out to give the grower an idea of what they may be facing, that pre-plant year, the year or more that we spend, like I mentioned before, selecting the site, developing the site, can be, I think, the most important year of the vineyard's life. And then after that, we'll look at planting, training, trellising. Somewhere down the road, we'll start to look at production, maybe the third year, but quite often it's going to be the fourth year before we're seeing much production. And actually, some of the work that we see on grapes would indicate that if we try to push the vineyard too much and try to crop it too heavily early in its life, we could compromise the ability of that vineyard to be productive for as long a period of time. So we want to take our time getting that vineyard into production, get the basic framework of the vine established, and get it up so that once we start to produce, we can get good yields, and we can expect good yields for an extended period of time. The vineyard floor, since most of our vineyards, and especially in the east and middle part of Tennessee, are on uneven land, floor management is very important. And the ideal situation we see is a sod cover with bare strips underneath the vines. The bare strip will give us better air drainage. It'll also help us on control of certain pests. The sod cover between the rows is going to act as a diffusion, deceleration strip for runoff water, and also for equipment support. I like to run rows north and south if possible. We intercept more sunlight in that type of situation, but my general recommendation is if we're on a sloping land, a uniformly sloped land, we run the rows across the slope. It's just easier to manage the floor. It's also more precise in pesticide applications, et cetera, on that type of a site. If we look at the annual growth and fruiting cycle for muscadines or bunch grapes, we'll find that during a given period, as indicated by the bottom part of this chart, vegetative growth in the current year, early on after bud break, we get a grand period of growth. This is a time where we need to make sure that we've got good insect and disease control and good quality foliage. And we'll be growing the vine, getting leaf area to support the crop and to support the vine itself. Fruiting, we'll see flower development coming in, bloom, fruit shatter, and then, of course, the crop will develop. But along about the time of bloom, we're going to start to see fruit bud initiation for the next year. And so it's important to realize that with muscadine jabs, with bunch grapes, that they're beginning about the time of bloom, we're also impacting next year's crop. And so the care that we give our vineyard not only is for the existing crop, but it's also looking at the one coming down the road. And so if we lose a crop, we don't want to back off too radically on our cultural program, because we could sacrifice the following year's crop as well. So moving on, we're going to just cover briefly fertilization of the vineyard. Now we're assuming that we did our liming and adding P and K early on a pre-plant situation. Once the vineyard is in the ground, we want to make sure that we monitor the site to see that it's in pretty good shape. And this will entail soil testing on a regular basis, possibly every third to fourth year. And then we would also like to put tissue analysis in on top of that. The reason for that, soil test in a post-plant situation is not a good measure of the actual nutrient level of the plant. What we want to do with soil tests is monitor the pH to keep the upper few inches of soil right. But then the tissue analysis will actually tell us the status of the vines themselves, and we'll use that as a primary guide to what fertilizers we need and what rates we may need to use. So we'll look at tissue analysis at least initially on a fairly frequent basis to establish a baseline for the crop. And then after we've done that, then on a regular intervals, we'll still use tissue analysis as a way to monitor development of that crop. Now, what we see in fertilizers is that nitrogen in most cases is the only element that we may need to apply on a regular basis. And it's one that we can, at least to a certain extent, get an idea of how good we are with our rates by looking at the plant and the crop. On the others, it's not as easy to assess the status, and that's another reason that we look at tissue analysis as an important factor. With a vine, since nitrogen is the element that we apply most frequently, how much do we need? Well, first off, muscadines have a relatively low nutrient requirement, and it's estimated at about 50 pounds of actual N per acre of nitrogen is adequate for the vines. And this includes nitrogen from all sources. And that's one thing that we need to take into account. If we apply nitrogen in the spring of the year, expect that about 40% of that nitrogen will actually leave the vineyard with the crop. That means that 60% of that applied nitrogen is in the leaves or the woody parts of the plant, or in some cases we'll lose some through leaching. But if we chop the prunings in the vineyard after we prune, then over time we're recycling over half of that nitrogen back into the vineyard. We need to take that into account when we look at how much N we're going to put down. Now, another thing we look at is the organic matter content of the soils. It's estimated that for each 1% organic matter in the soil, a vine can get and take up about 15 to 20 pounds of actual N. So if you've got 2% organic matter, you may come close to satisfying the total nitrogen need of that vineyard simply from mineralization of that organic matter. So we need to take those into account when we look at our rates for that element. Now, another thing we look at too is when should we fertilize? And what we find is that for the first several weeks of the growing season following bud break, the plant is growing utilizing reserves within the plant. That is carbohydrates, nitrogen that have been stored in the plant from the previous growing season, provides the energy for new growth, new shoot growth in that vine. And we'll see that from about bud burst up to bloom, that growth is dependent on stored reserves. Now, once we get new shoot growth and leaves start to unfold, once those leaves become about half full size, they will become an exporter of photosynthase and will support the new shoots that are growing above. But remember, the first few weeks we're looking on stored reserves, so we don't want to apply our nitrogen early, like at bud burst or before, because by the time we get to the point that the plant may actually be able to take it up, we may have lost a good bit of that nitrogen due to leaching or other factors. So once we get up to about bloom, the carbon reserves in the plant are fairly well depleted. The roots are starting to pick up moisture and nutrients and supplying the needs of the plant. And at that time, the new shoots, the shoot tips, are the main sinks for photosynthase from the developing leaves, or the leaves that are over half grown. And once we start to see fruit set, then the developing crop is going to become increasingly competitive with the shoot growth for the photosynthase. As we move on up to veraison, and from veraison to harvest, the competition from the clusters or from the fruit will slow down shoot growth. They'll compete quite successfully and slow down fruit growth. So, okay, I've lost my video. Okay, I've lost my video here. So as the crop gets further along, as like I said, once we get veraison to harvest, the crop becomes a major sink for photosynthase. And as we, excuse me, as we approach harvest, more and more of the photosynthase are being directed to that crop. Moving along, I cannot see my video, but the next step is after harvest, what we're seeing is a very important time for the crop in that we've removed the fruit. We still hopefully have good, healthy leaf area, and that we can, okay, there we go, got it back. We can go, now we can focus on taking care of the vine for next year. So after harvest, the primary function of the plant is to store nutrients to help it over winter and to carry through for that first flush of growth in the spring. And there's a procedure, we call it resorption, where the nutrients are pulled out of the leaves and back into the vines. And resorption is very important, and it's a strong reason for keeping the leaves healthy on the vine all the way up until natural leaf drop due to frost or freezes. Resorption is an energy requiring process, so we need to have healthy leaves, so whatever it takes to keep that foliage healthy will enable that plant to store more nutrients and to carry it through for the rest of the growing season. Now, just a few quick words on other aspects of the vineyard. The trellis should be something you don't compromise on. It should last the life of the vineyard. It needs to be strong. The function of the trellis, of course, is to support the vine and the crop, to expose fruit and foliage to sunlight. And that, to do that, the trellis needs to be fairly strong so that the light penetration, the air movement within the vine is going to be good throughout the growing season. It opens the canopy up to air movement and spray penetration for good pest control, and also makes it easier to take care of the vineyard. And then just a little bit on pruning. We prune to get better sunlight penetration, air movement, and spray coverage through the canopy, and to promote the growth in desired areas. And we want to get rid of old wood, dead wood, broken wood, diseased wood. And by doing that and by making other pruning cuts, we can encourage the development of new wood for future crops. In addition to that, as we prune, we're adjusting crop size. And that's important because we don't want to have too large a crop and stress the vines. What we'll see quite often in Tennessee is marginal cold damage to the vine. And we can see aerial rooting on the lower two pictures in this slide. We also see splitting of the trunks and cordons. Aerial rooting is quite common. I see it in almost every vineyard. Sometimes it gets severe enough to compromise the vine. Others, at times it's not. If we get late freezes, then it's when we see the more splitting of the cordons and the trunks. we've got to react to those. One problem we see in some vineyards, young vineyards, is southwest trunk damage on the lower part of the trunk. It occurs generally within 18 inches or so of the ground, and that bark is relatively thin on a young vine. It may be that we can either wrap with a white guard, or we can paint the trunks to keep the trunks cooler, to keep those cells from becoming rehydrated and less susceptible to freezing and bursting. So that's an important thing that we look at in some years. Now, it doesn't happen every year, but there's no way of knowing ahead of time whether it's going to be an issue or not. So it may be something you want to do, it may not be. As far as cropping, overcropping a vine means that while you may have more fruit, the fruit quality is going to be off. It's also going to compromise the growth of the vines, and the vines may not grow enough to fill their allocated area, which means that next year's crop is going to be reduced as a result. Undercropping, generally we look at that as an over pruning situation, and when we do that, we have too much plant vigor, we get too much shade, poor fruit bud development, poor fruit quality. We can see some issues there. So adjusting crop load is going to be an important part of growing. When to prune, one of the things I generally tell people is to wait as late as you can to prune, yet still get it all done. Annual pruning is important. If you prune during the dormant stage, you do have you have a higher potential of certain canker diseases. Botryophyria dieback, for example, is one that we see quite a bit in grapes and muscadines. And as long as that dormant pruning cut is open, it's susceptible to infection. Whereas if we prune after the plant is no longer dormant, healing will start immediately. So late pruning allows you to protect that wound a little bit, and also to assess what damage you may have had over the winter. So again, canker disease is one of the important things. Grapefruit borer is a problem, and it's been looked at for many years. And if you look at the literature, it's interesting to see the comments. Grapefruit borer is something that we don't see, primarily because it's underground for almost all of its life cycle, and the damage it does weakens the vines gradually, and quite often what we see are vines that will pass away due to, we say, cold injury, when in reality it may be grapefruit borers that are causing the problem. The impact on yield, this is studied in Georgia with larval feeding on the roots of the vine, or we'll see that just one larvae on the roots can result in about a 30% yield reduction, 2 larvae about 50%. If we look at the basal part of the trunk, and here you can see some pretty heavy damage on the trunk. Again, 1 larvae girdling about 6% of the trunk gives us almost a 50% yield reduction. 2 larvae, about 75% reduction. And of course, those vines are going to be weakened and much more apt to be killed by adverse weather conditions. So grapefruit borer control generally is looked at as an integrated approach. Muscadines are susceptible. In fact, they may be more so than bunch grapes, since the root system tends to be a little shallower. One of the primary things we look at on grapefruit borer control is grass and weed management under the vines. And also, along with that, we're looking at high, narrow canopies, row orientation, anything that will increase sunlight hitting the ground around the base of the vine is going to help in grapefruit borer control, because when the borer emerges, they mate and lay eggs, and the eggs hatch out, and the larvae drop to the soil. A large percentage of those larvae will die due to desiccation if we have good sunlight reaching the base of the vine. So looking at conditions within that in the vineyard, pheromone trapping to monitor is a good idea to know whether or not you have grapefruit borer pressure. And then there are, well, Lorsban is labeled for grapefruit borer, but how much longer that will last and its effectiveness is not that great. A mating disruption looks promising, but there are limitations. But again, grapefruit borer is something that we need to pay attention to. To wrap it all up, there are some good references for information on growing muscadines. The Southeast Regional Small Fruit Consortium publishes a management guide every year with the best insecticide, fungicide recommendations and herbicides. That should be a valuable resource. And there's also a production guide on the Small Fruit Consortium website. So with that, I've pretty much run through the course. If there are any questions I may answer, I'll be glad to try to do so. Okay, I see one question that says, mentioned that commercial production of muscadines was discouraged in Tennessee in the 70s. What changed that? Is it improved cultivation practices or increased demand for the product or both? Is that the same case for Georgia? It appears to a layperson that commercial muscadine production has increased in visibility in the past several years in Georgia. In Tennessee, we were seeing a lot of consistent cold injury in our vineyards. What changed that? We have seen modifications of our winter temperatures, and overall they're milder. That's certainly encouraged it. But I also think that more attention looking at site selection and development, variety selection and vineyard management has changed our success, and I think the same could be said for Georgia. We've got a lot of interest in muscadine production because in our wineries, muscadines are quite often the best-selling wines that we make, and so the demand is high, and so our growers, our wineries are very interested in being able to have a local source of fruit, and that has done probably more than anything else to encourage the interest in muscadine production. So let's see if there's another. Okay. Are there any other questions that I might try to answer? And at this time, I don't see any. Hopefully, I'm not missing some, but thank you very much. I hope that this has been worthwhile for you, and hope you have a good day and a good growing season. Thank you.